Oh, Grandpa Miyazaki. What do we do with you? Anime, much like every other form of mass media entertainment, has its share of figureheads that have loomed over the entirety of its own existence. Titans of such magnitude that their entire existence could be whittled down to one name. Hollywood has an abundance of such people in the likes of Hitchcock, Spielberg, Lucas, and way too many others that blur the line between historical appreciation and cult of personality. Anime, in turn, has Tezuka, Takahata, and the one above all, Miyazaki. Not to put too fine a point on it, but when Google has your picture listed as the very first result when you type in anime director, your legacy has been pretty much cemented in history. But to me, what makes Miyazaki so fascinating as a person, as well as an artist, is that his legacy has become so much more complicated from where it began. At least here in the States it has. Back in the halcyon days of 1997, when Miyazaki was fairly unknown outside of Japan, there seemed to have been an overcorrecting of sorts when the media began to swirl around the North American release of Princess Mononoke. Sure, you could attribute this to the ravenous Disney PR machine, but the lengths that people went to fall over themselves is kind of embarrassing when you look at it with today's eyes.
I love your work, art director. I love your films.
It's my great pleasure to bring onto the elegant stage producer Toshio Suzuki and master director Hayao Miyazaki.
Mr. Miyazaki is a god to all of the Western animators.
But if I could play a bit of devil's advocacy, it was just the time. 1997 is a lot further back than people my age would want to admit to, mostly because it means we're a lot older than we want to admit to. It truly was a different time, made all the more evident by those that were caught in the film's orbit. Like, hi Billy Bob Thornton, hi Claire Danes, hi Harvey Weinstein! Like I said, different time. Unfortunate associations aside, the late 90s were a groundbreaking time for the anime industry, as the mainstream American press sat up and took notice of anime as it never had before, spearheaded by this one man and his film. When the previous American notion of cartoons from Japan called to mind the likes of Speed Racer, Voltron, and maybe Dragon Ball? And that's if they don't call to mind scenes like this. Well, how could the discussion not turn into, wow, a cartoon from Japan that doesn't look cheap, isn't a cyberpunk philosophy snooze fest, and I could watch this with my kids.
Let me pass! I'm warning you!
Eh, 2 out of 3 ain't bad. The overriding narrative surrounding Miyazaki became less a man who directed and animated a very well-made film, and more of one that's based in idolatry. But whether or not someone believes that Miyazaki deserves such a status, the point remains that a lot of this adulation and laurels and examinations were rooted not in Miyazaki's talent or drive, but in ignorance of his chosen medium.
In Miyazaki's films, he oftentimes exaggerates the mouth and the eyes to convey extreme emotion. And that in the new Tarzan picture from Disney, baby Tarzan seemed to look exactly like a character in a Miyazaki film.
Well, I suppose you could make the argument that the animators on Disney's Tarzan were aping, so to speak, from Miyazaki, but it's not like Miyazaki pioneered the aesthetic of exaggerated eyes and mouths, or even popularized it. Which is ironic because if you do want to attribute the source of that aesthetic, you have to look towards Max Fleischer and, ironically, Walt Disney. I believe we already covered this, but if you need a refresher... In fact, Miyazaki, clearly uncomfortable with being in the American limelight and having to talk through an interpreter, tries to tell Ebert that he's not really the source of inspiration he thinks he is, using a metaphorical answer.
自分たちの仕事をクリエイティブな仕事というよりも、リレーというその競技がありますね。リレーのように考えてます。僕らは子供の時に誰かからバトンをもらったんです。でそのバトンをそのまま渡すんじゃなくて、自分の体の中を一度通してそれを次の子供たちに渡すんだっていうふうに、そういう仕事だと思ってます。
But it's hard to fault Ebert, or anyone else for that matter, for being swept up in the air of the new, because that's what he represented. something new to Americans at large. And from Princess Mononoke to Spirited Away, and after unearthing his previous works in Kiki's Delivery Service and My Neighbor Totoro, it had seemed that America had recognized the heir apparent to Walt Disney. To this day, you're still going to find people that will hold him in this almost reverential light, but the general attitude surrounding him has grown more...
これを作る人たちは痛みとかそういうものについてね、何も考えないでやってるでしょ。極めて不愉快ですよね。
Shall we say acerbic? And from there, the stories began trickling down, all about the man and how it's really like to work with him, and how the tea spilled. My personal favorite industry story is the time that Hideaki Anno sat down to record a commentary track for the Blu-ray release of Nausicaa, and he just winds up spending most of it calling Miyazaki an old geezer and bitching about how much of a miserable old bastard he is, berating animators for simple mistakes, and stealing cassette players only to return them after he used it so much that it broke. Weirdly enough, the both of them maintain that they're still friends, and Anno still is one of the only few anime directors that Miyazaki has any kind words to say about. And that's including his own son, Goro.
いやだからね、演出やめたっていいんですよ。やめた方がいいんですよ本当は。向いてない。
Is it any wonder that Goro's movie Tales from Earthsea features a scene in which a prince kills the king, his own father? Hell, maybe that's why Hayao Miyazaki walked out of the film. Because of course he did. I could go on and on about the many callous things he has said and done, but the point to take away from this is that if there's any cognitive dissonance surrounding him, it's not really on him. He has made no secret about his thoughts and feelings, as per the numerous available clips of him on the record being an out-and-out asshole. But it wasn't Miyazaki that built up this idyllic vision of him being this master storyteller that weaves true, heartfelt emotions into his stories. On both sides of the Pacific, the respective media and PR machines did that for him. His films have been advertised as magical and heartfelt, but therein lies the key. They were advertised as magical and heartfelt. And that's reason number one with a bullet why Miyazaki could never be the quote-unquote next Walt Disney, because Walt Disney, at the end of the day, was a businessman and knew well enough to keep up appearances for the sake of the image. Hell, the man kept an ashtray in his pocket because he refused to let himself be seen smoking in front of children. Miyazaki, on the other hand, never gave a crap. Quoted from an article he did in 1989 and republished in a collection of memoirs and essays called Starting Point, I'm assuming there will be a loud chorus of other people mourning his passing, and I do not intend to add my voice to it. Granted, this was in the context of Miyazaki trying to separate himself from the inspiration that Tezuka was to him, as he wanted to be his own artist with his own vision. But to publicly state that he wouldn't even bother missing the guy, this isn't so much brutal honesty as it is the living embodiment of, look out, we got ourselves a badass over here. And as the years have gone by, the man has only found new ways to give less of a shit.
極めて何か生命に対する侮辱を感じます。
Alright, there is a fine line between wanting to maintain the integrity of hand-drawn animation and just out-and-out shitting on someone. And Miyazaki just flew past that line on a flaming cigarette boat giving the double bird. By the by, I can't help but feel sorry for this poor man. I mean, he probably should have known better than to try and show an AI-driven animation program to Hayao freaking Miyazaki, but that doesn't excuse the way he was treated. At the top of this episode, I called Miyazaki fascinating, and, well, being an asshole isn't fascinating. So where does that leave us? Well, with his films. Art can be seen as a portrait of the artist in many instances, but here within Miyazaki's works in particular, I find that they're more portraits of how he wants to be, or more precisely, how I think he wants to be seen. And in that spirit, there could be no better choice to settle some accounts than where the American relationship with Miyazaki began, here in Princess Mononoke. Some might be able to point to Spirited Away as being Miyazaki's best overall film, but for the purposes of looking at his entire filmography as well as the man himself, there could really only be one choice. This is Princess Mononoke. Set in a hodgepodge amalgamation of actual Japanese history, the story centers on Prince Ashitaka, the last in line of a dying tribe that is shook to its core by the arriving destruction of a boar god, cursed by iron shaped by human hands. This curse latches onto Ashitaka's arm, inevitably creeping further and further into his body and slowly killing him.
You cannot alter your fate, my prince. However, you can rise to meet it if you choose.
Seemingly unfazed by the grim news, Ashitaka is instead honor-bound by his position as prince to investigate how the boar was cursed, leading him out of his secluded village to never return again. His travels set him toward a unique settlement on the banks of a river called Irontown, run by a Lady Eboshi who has mined the area for its precious wartime metals, such as the iron that felled the boar. As its protector and caregiver, Lady Eboshi is benevolent in her giving shelter and means of self-reliance to women who are forced as sex workers, as well as the lepers who are shunned for their tragic disease. But she is also ruthless in her single-minded goal of keeping Irontown prosperous and safe from both the invading forces of a local lord, historically known as a daimyo, named Asano, as well as the forces of nature that hunt her men in retaliation for Irontown's ravaging of the local environment, led by the wolf goddess Moro and her adopted daughter, San.
We killed her!
You forget she's a god. It will take more than that.
Ashitaka is caught between both worlds, as his tribe had tried to live collectively with nature in the spiritual realm that inhabit it, but he also is only too aware of why Eboshi has clung so fervently to her people, as the habit of life is hard to break in mankind.
Life is suffering. It is hard. The world is cursed, but still, you find reasons to keep living.
But as Ashitaka tries to mediate between Irontown and Moro, the curse that has plagued his body only grows stronger with the fuel of hatred from both sides, unable to come to terms with each other or abide by each other's existence. But the tipping point of no return looms nigh as Eboshi has her eyes set on the forest spirit itself, believing that delivering its head to the Emperor might finally win her Irontown freedom from Asano's forces, caring not what consequences it would bring to both the environment and its denizens. Likewise, the Brethren of the Boar God are restless with the lack of action against the humans in Irontown, vowing vengeance for their fallen leader, or die trying.
Even if every one of us dies, it will be a battle the humans will never forget.
Whether by the death of the forest spirit or by the destruction of the human settlements, conflict and death seem inevitable, as Ashitaka's time dwindles and dwindles, the vision of a peaceful future blinded by blood-stained eyes, forever set out of reach. As is typical with a Miyazaki feature film, there are many a thoughtful and rich theme at play here, chief among them being man versus nature. In Miyazaki's works, these themes are touched upon again and again, some more obvious than others.
Human? Ugh. What do you know about humans, Brunhilde? They spoil the sea. They treat your home like they're empty black souls.
And some even more obvious than others.
What about things like rabbits and badgers? They can't transform, so where do they go?
But in Princess Mononoke, these themes are approached in a way that I think Miyazaki has never done before. Or since. Ever since he was young, Miyazaki had a fascination and affinity for the natural world, and you could see it in pretty much every film he has directed. Even the Castle of Cagliostro had scenes of the characters quietly contemplating in lush, green-filled gardens. Not to mention the fact that the climax arrives by way of the great treasure revealing itself to be ruins of a once great kingdom being reclaimed by nature. Likewise, in Mononoke, these themes of nature encroaching on man, and vice versa, are unmissable. To look at the story of Princess Mononoke and take away from it an environmentalist message is certainly an easy thing to do, and it certainly also makes for an easy soundbite or two.
It's really topical, because we're consuming copious amounts of earth, and we're being really destructive.
Since the idea of an environmentalist story was, and still kind of is, mired in a tired sense of black and white morality, i.e. the evil, greedy humans destroying the lush, beautiful, and innocent forest, that Princess Mononoke went out of its way to give the human side of the conflict a more nuanced and even empathetic reason for its role in the story was to the film's credit. You could point the finger at Lady Eboshi as being the bad guy of our story, but when you break down her character and her motivations, she reveals herself as the most understanding and complex quote-unquote antagonist in the entirety of Miyazaki's canon. True, she is single-minded, and she shirks off warnings from Ashitaka to stop her hunt for the forest spirit, but these flaws in her character are not born from greed or hubris, but from desperation. and it's not as if Eboshi wanted to completely demolish the natural world, and even respected nature enough to want a garden for the town, realizing the beauty and sustainability from which they're dependent upon. Miyazaki doesn't frame the conflict as stemming from ignorance or greed, but rather as a sad fact of life, almost as if the nature of conflict is inevitable. Likewise, the forces of nature, the wolf goddess and boar gods in particular, are equally portrayed with flaws as well. Moro, despite being portrayed as a voice of wisdom and reason, still participates in the slaughtering of humans who weren't posing immediate danger to her or her kind, picking them off as they were transporting supplies. And just as we're able to justify Eboshi's actions, so too can we justify Moro and San's actions as them just being proactive in protecting their home. But a more extreme example can be found in the boar god Okoto, literally and figuratively blinded by the actions of the humans that, even knowing that their charge against them will most likely be met with slaughter, he and his don't seem to care.
The last one left alive will still be charging blindly forward.
The reason why so many environmentalist stories rely on such black and white concepts of morality is because of its intent. If a story is meant to spur its audience into acting to protect the environment, it must be able to portray the environment as the completely wronged party. Therefore, the offending party has to be almost inexcusable in its greed, ignorance, or both.
'Cause greedy human beings will always lend a hand.
Whereas with Mononoke, sure, we could look at the actions of the humans, relatively nuanced as they mostly are, and see where we can do better. But then what would be the point of portraying the forces of nature in an equally unflattering light? When the film goes out of its way to juxtapose the swarming swine as just like the carousing drunk men, like here in this purposeful edit,
He's feeling no pain.
what is really being accomplished? It might not be flattering for the human side of things to be compared openly to pigs, but if nature is supposed to be the wronged party, wouldn't that just defeat its own purpose? Comparison is a two-way street, so to do it would make the boars just as culpable and as short-sighted as the humans. To put it bluntly, if the film intended for us to take a simple environmentalist message from it, then why in the world does the plot seem to focus entirely on Ashitaka struggling with what the right thing to do is?
Just whose side is he on, anyway?
Throughout the story, it's Ashitaka that struggles with his part in the conflict, seeing as how he is the outsider to both the spirits of the forest and citizens of Irontown. And because he is the outsider, he is able to see that both sides have their reasons for doing what they do, which sadly oppose the other. Though he was sent to find the source of the corruption in the boar god at the start of the story, he doesn't immediately side with the forest, even though he comes from a tribe that both respects and lives alongside the spirits of nature.
We have nothing to worry about here.
Ah!
Would you be kind enough to grant us passage through your forest, little one?
Oh no.
He has every reason to just side with San and Moro and help them drive out the citizens of Irontown away from the forest. But that would betray the singular coda of the film.
There is evil at work in the land to the west, Prince Ashitaka. It's your fate to go there and see what you can see with eyes unclouded by hate.
Right from the beginning, the message of looking beyond hate is the mantra by which the morality, and therefore the entire plot of the story, revolves around. If we were to look at the instigating point of the story, the call to action that starts our journey, what do we see? We could point to Irontown clear-cutting trees and disrupting the homes of the spirits of the forest, or we could look even further and point to the Emperor's emissary having told Lady Eboshi that she could curry favor by severing the forest spirit's head.
You made me a promise. Now once you get me the head of the forest spirit, then we can come back and destroy Lord Asano together, huh?
And we could even look to the daimyo as the reason why Irontown needs to protect itself in the first place by hunting the forest spirit, but all of this doesn't answer the question of why Ashitaka, our protagonist, must intervene. We have to look at the source of the curse. The iron musket ball inside of the boar god. That it was made from iron panned from the sands surrounding Irontown seems thematically apropos for where the story is going. But if it was the iron itself, then why would feelings of hatred and fury fuel the curse?
Flames growing inside of me.
That this curse took the form of a bullet is not coincidence. It's not the iron itself that which fuels the curse, but rather the malice behind it. Ashitaka, despite at odds with himself and what to do, knows well enough that at the source of the conflict is the inability for both sides to see the other for what they are, both literally in the cases of Hokoto and Moro, and figuratively with Eboshi. The emotional climax and catharsis comes not with the revelation that hatred and fury are something that could be destroyed, as even the story points out that those feelings have their moments of nobility.
Kyo, what are you doing?
Rather, the climax occurs when Ashitaka convinces San that her hatred of the humans could be set aside so the greater good can be achieved. Because though the balance of life and death was upset by humanity, it's only humanity that can set the balance right.
Ashitaka, you mean so much to me, but I can't forgive the humans for what they've done.
I understand. You'll live in the forest, and I'll go help them rebuild Irontown.
I've mentioned this before in a previous video, but John Keats once called Shakespeare the greatest of all writers in a letter because of what he called negative capability, of Shakespeare's ability to not let the story sway one way or the other to show one side being in the right. The most classic example of this is Shakespeare's most famous play, Romeo and Juliet. Though both characters were young and impulsive, it's not the both of them killing themselves that is the ultimate tragedy. It's that their families had this long-standing hatred of each other that neither side really addresses or even questions. That is the driving force behind their suicides, as well as numerous murders throughout the story. It's their shared hatred that is the true villain of the story.
A plague on both your houses!
Likewise, Princess Mononoke frames both sides as being incapable of just taking a moment and question why they need to fight in the first place. Would Hokoto and Moro have picked off as many humans as they have if they knew how desperate Lady Eboshi and her people were to escape the daimyo? Would Lady Eboshi have needlessly killed the forest spirit if she weren't so consumed by the drive to save her people? It's this mutual lack of understanding and hurt that kept the fires of conflict alive, and only through a shared act of setting aside animosity for the sake of the good of all is harmony restored. Miyazaki obviously believes that humanity has a part in the natural world, but it also seems that he looks at their relationship as adversarial. To say nothing of the many times he has cast mankind as the instigating factor of the conflict in his stories of man versus nature, it's only here in Mononoke that he shows sympathy towards the plight of humanity. And if I were to hazard a guess as to why this is, I feel it has a lot to do with the time when he wrote what would become Princess Mononoke. He had already had the conceptual art for the characters and setting drawn decades before the film was released. But the story beats and framework, that would have to come later. During the promotion for the North American release of Princess Mononoke, Miyazaki stops at a nearby Los Angeles bar where he stated that he wrote the notes that would become Mononoke between 1979 and 1984. The exact dates are left ambiguous. Why was he in America during such a time? Well, again, the documentary doesn't go into too many details, but for those that are in the know, that would be the exact time frame that he worked on the pilot film for Little Nemo. He states in the interview that it was a plain nightmare to work on, and that he would constantly disagree with the producers on the direction of the story. From this frame of mind, presumably drinking his frustrations and anger away, he wrote what would become My Neighbor Totoro, Nausicaa, and Princess Mononoke. And realizing that, it's no wonder that his story focuses so much on not only the nature of conflict, but also the nature of cognitive dissonance, of saying one thing but doing another. Lady Eboshi purposefully created Irontown as a means to shelter and house sex workers and goes out of her way to voice her distrust of men.
Jigo's riflemen may turn on us, and if that happens, I'll need every one of you here to fight them. Remember, you can't trust men.
And yet her most trusted and loyal bodyguard is a man. The pool of life that Ashitaka is brought to heal his wounds has the remains of death littered on its floor. Even the forest spirit, the morally superior being of the entire film, is crowned with tree root-like antlers, animal-like fur, and a human-like face. All of these interwoven contradictions stemming from a time in which Hayao Miyazaki absolutely despised doing something he loved. Peter Senji, professor at MIT, once wrote, "Scratch the surface of most cynics and you find a frustrated idealist. Someone who made the mistake of converting his ideals into expectations." When you break down the films of Hayao Miyazaki, they are the works of an idealist, Works that explore the wonders of nature, imagination, and the spiritual links that bind together human history and the history of the world. They hit emotional chords and speak to shared truths that spread beyond borders. But where his ideals seem to fail him is in the process of making his art a reality, as well as reality itself. In Miyazaki's world, humans learn that they have their place in the natural world, and they thrive in it without destruction. That even when natural disasters wipe out the homes of many, a happy ending is never far around the corner. That people, no matter their background, could come together to do the right thing for everyone and everything. And that these ideals are championed and learned through art made for those that are just starting out in the world. Of course, when reality comes poking through time and time again, it's quite easy to turn cynical, pessimistic, and, well... If I had to sum up the man and his work, it's that he is the most public example of an idealistic artist being ground down by reality. Sure, it's kind of funny to see just how out of his way he's gone to be a jerk, but his life reads to me as a specific kind of tragedy. He is an artist who strived to make manifest his idealistic world and grew sour when it couldn't be true, or when he failed to live up to those same ideals. In essence, he's an asshole who can't help but be an asshole, no matter how hard he tries. Maybe that's why, despite hating the industry and thinking that the world is just going to swallow up humanity and drown cities to wipe it all clean, and despite retiring multiple times, he's still trying to live up to his ideals. Because what else could he do? Princess Mononoke by itself is a fantastically realized film and deserving of every bit of adulation it has gotten over the years. But it's also a sad portrait of a man who just couldn't be what he wanted to be. And as sobering as that thought might be, a more sobering anniversary is almost upon us. And in that spirit, there could be no better time than to talk about a certain anime. Till next time.